Welcome everybody to our briefing today on sort of anti-Asian violence and the efforts that AABANY has engaged in, and we're so happy you made the time to join us. I'm pleased to introduce Terry Shen, AABANY president, and he's going to tell us a little bit about what we're going to hear about today. Terry?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Chris. So I'm Terry Shen. I'm the president of AABANY. In my spare time, I'm also a corporate lawyer at Kramer Levin. And one genesis for this event is that we at AABANY have been fielding numerous questions and requests from law firms, schools, corporations, financial institutions, to get a better understanding of this Asian hate crime national crisis that we're in. What's the magnitude and the nature of the crisis, and what can we do about it, both organizationally and as individuals. And fortunately, we've seen a major step in dealing with the Asian hate crime national crisis. Recently, a bill promoted by Congresswoman Grace Meng was signed into law by President Biden, the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act. This morning, I was on the phone with Congresswoman Meng's office to, we were basically patting ourselves on the back for this success, and also discussing with her, where do we go from here? The new law, as some of you may know, is a tremendous step forward in achieving greater information and transparency in understanding the national scope of this crisis. What we think the work now entails is, where we want to bring the fight is to foster a greater understanding among the elected officials, prosecutors' offices, and law enforcement that is actually at the forefront of addressing Asian hate crimes, to equip them better in identifying Asian hate crimes and prosecuting them and delivering justice. This is a very new situation for a lot of people. It is a situation that, although there are good intentions at all levels of government, many people on the front lines of this don't fully understand. And we think, and so does Congresswoman Meng's office, they believe that this is the next area where we can make tremendous progress in. So that having been said, I'm going to turn it back to Chris. Him and Karen and Yang are going to talk in greater detail about what the nature of the national crisis is, how we've gotten here, what we've done, and what more there is to do.
Thank you, Terry. And the AABANY has been just a wonderful platform to work together with really amazing people and lawyers on this issue. And together, we have been able to be greater than the sum of all the great people in AABANY. And that has really, reinforced, the power of a community of working together, and what we're here today to do is to tell you what we've done, tell you a little bit about the history, so that we know where we come from in the last year or so, bring us to the present point, and then point us to the future, as Terry has so nicely put into words in his opening remarks. I'm just going to sort of tell you 6 things that that I see sort of happening right now, that are changing, that are affecting us. And 3 of them are trends I see in the mainstream community, sort of the mainstream of American sort of public, consciousness. And then 3 trends that I see within the Asian American community that are happening right now. So the three main trends in the mainstream community, which you might have noticed, is that Asian Americans are in the public consciousness for the first time in a very, very, important way. So people are talking about this issue. People are wondering about this issue. People are thinking, I need to find out more. That's really unprecedented, to be frank. Um, Number two, there's a realization that Asian Americans experience discrimination and violence. And that is something that is also new to the mainstream. I think most people, and you've heard this before about minority and other things like that, they think, oh, Asian Americans are basically doing okay. They don't experience problems. They have no, systemic sort of racial issues. They're just doing fine. And there is a growing realization that that's not true across the board. And third is the growing political power of Asian Americans. And this was happening before the pandemic. If you look at the last presidential election in Atlanta, Asian Americans were an important part of the coalition that gave the state from the South to a Democratic president, a Democratic candidate. It also helped sort of swing the senatorial elections, both to two Democratic senators from Georgia, which is very unusual if you're into politics, right? And so there's a growing realization, a lot, working along coalitions, primarily, everyone's heard of Stacey Abrams and the work she's done with getting people to the polls, African Americans, Latinos, but also, most importantly, Asian Americans. And so those three things are really happening within the mainstream. Um, and then three things that are happening within the Asian American community itself is that I think there's a great deal of self-reflection and education that's going on within the Asian American community. From many Asian Americans that have not thought about race, didn't think that race really affected them. I think they've reconsidered and now are in a process of learning. And as a result, my point too is that there's a community that's being created and recreated and made stronger by that realization. So there's a growing sense of, like, I can see it everywhere in terms of the arts, politics, community of webinars. You can watch hundreds of hours of webinars on Asian American related issues if you wanted to, and there's just a lot happening. And then third, Asian Americans and philanthropy. There's just an enormous amount of money, both coming from major foundations to Asian American nonprofits in huge amounts. Asian American nonprofits have traditionally been undersourced, and that is beginning to change in a really dramatic way. And then Asian Americans themselves are committing large sums of money. We'll talk more later about other efforts outside of AABANY. If you've heard about the Asian American Foundation, I was checking last night just to see how much money they had raised. When they announced they had 125 million. And then a month and a half later, they had 250 million. And then yesterday they announced they had raised $1 billion. And I was like, are you serious? We'll see where this goes, but that's some serious money. If and the goal of the Asian American Foundation is to, work on Asian American issues solely. So that's an enormous amount of money that's going to result in a lot of change and a lot of interesting new programs coming forward. So those are three quick things for the mainstream and for the Asian American community, just to begin. So I think what I'm going to do is we're going to begin with a little bit of history for AABANY and about where we were and how it led to um, the report and what we've been doing with the report since. Um, so in 2020, early 2020, January 2020, think back to those days, when things are still sort of normal. We have been hearing about the coronavirus in Wuhan, but it seemed really far away. But then when there were briefings and thoughts that it might come, as you remember, President Trump, said China virus from the presidential podium. And when he said that, um, AABANY was really sort of, it set off alarms because we knew that that kind of language from the presidential podium would be dangerous. So the Issues Committee, wrote an op-ed warning about weaponizing coronavirus language and how that would harm Asian Americans. And we knew that sort of very early on, that that was going to be a threat. In April, AABANY sponsored a webinar in April 2020, looking at the history of associating Asians with disease, and how that would, how history, if you read it, will tell you all about the present moment. And we knew where we were going, and it was a really, really scary moment. And the press was really focused on, sort of that language. And that President Trump had a back and forth with a CBS reporter who was Chinese American about that, and the focus was really on that. And then we had the shock of the shutdown in March, and we were all shut down, except for frontline workers, and everyone was just really scared, right? And that kind of put the damper on anti-Asian violence for a while, because, of course, we were all home. The only Asian Americans that were experiencing it, unfortunately, were frontline workers, and they were sort of at the forefront of experiencing that. And then the attention, and today is the anniversary of the death of George Floyd, and we know that looking back a year, that really changed everything in our country. And it really shifted the focus away from anti-Asian violence and the Wuhan virus, or the COVID-19, to BLM and to George Floyd. And in AABANY, of course, we support BLM and we support the reforms. We think it was a critically important conversation to have. But internally, we didn't think the anti-Asian violence narrative or reality was going to go away. We saw the media focus go away, but we knew that the reality would be there once, and particularly once we would get out of the shutdown and be out there. So Young and I think, had a lot of conversations where we talked about how do we, make sure that this issue doesn't go away, that it's taken seriously, and that together with focusing on BLM, we can do both. We can chew gum and we can talk about the issues that as AABANY that we were concerned about. And that really was the genesis of the paper, in terms of sort of how and why we wanted to do that. And so we just started kicking around and started sort of getting together critical members of the team in order to make it happen. And so I think that, so one more thing is then we reached out to Stop AAPI Hate, which now has blown up into a massive organization. But very early on, they were the ones that were collecting all the data points, that were keeping the issue an important issue within the public imagination. So I think, Karen King, I'm going to hand it off to you, because I think that the next part of the story is yours.
Karen, you're on mute.
Sorry, everyone. Thank you for letting me know. Thank you also, everyone, for joining us. I see a lot of friends out there who have worked with AABANY over the last year, and I'm so touched that you're joining us here today. As Chris was saying, as the pandemic was unfolding in the United States, we were seeing a rise of anti-Asian hate and anti-Asian violence, and we partnered and we're in touch with Stop AAPI Hate in order to track some of the data and reporting that was coming in. And there are many community organizations who were flagging this issue alongside AABANY from the very beginning, from the fourth quarter of 2019 and January of 2020. And as the pandemic increased and the sort of panic and fear rose, the number of incidents also was going up until the stay-at-home orders came down. And so we at AABANY wanted to start the process of reaching out to community members, getting information out to the Asian American community about their rights and resources should they be victims or targets of anti-Asian hate, as well as multiple other pandemic-related issues that were really impacting the Asian American community. And so I do want to give a shout out to Simpson Thatcher for working with us on a Know Your Rights brochure and website designed to get information out to the community, as well as Know Your Rights on multiple other topics. AABANY organized a number of webinars for both lawyers who wanted to do something and help the community, as well as for community members. And we had a lot of help doing some of these presentations in foreign languages. Thanks, of course, to Paul Weiss and Simpson for helping us with those webinars as well early on in the pandemic. And as Chris mentioned, the idea of this paper was really born because we wanted to make sure the incidents were being documented, that this phenomena and this surge, which is not unique in American history, as we talk about in the paper, is really part of a cycle that tends to surge and recede depending on the economic conditions of the country. And in times of stress or fear, unfortunately, hate just surges itself. And this is not the first time that Asians have been targeted in that kind of push out of fear and stress. So we decided to put together this paper to examine some of the root causes for the most recent surge, to talk about some of the challenges that the community faces in addressing these issues, as well as coming up with solutions. And of course, as a lawyers organization, we wanted to put forth some suggestions and ideas for concrete initiatives that could be taken to improve the laws, to improve education on the subject, and to get the word out and work with either the district attorneys or federal government officials and the administration to find ways to prevent this from happening in the future and to resolving some of the underlying root causes in the current phenomena. So the paper took many months to put together, as you might imagine from looking at it. We had tremendous help from the Paul Weiss Associates, who worked with me on this report in the first instance, as well as numerous law students that wanted to get involved and volunteered their time to help with finding sites and resources and proofreading. It was really a collaborative effort. We also went, of course, within AABANY, got comments from everyone, and Chris, as a co-editor, had a great deal of input into the report, as well as outside of AABANY. We reached to some of our partners in the community, some allies, other bar associations, other minority groups, and got feedback. We even sent it to the NYPD to give them an opportunity to weigh in. So we really wanted this to be a thoughtful piece that took into account a lot of the debate that was happening within our communities, and present a balanced view of what we thought the situation was and the best way forward. The report itself was finalized and kind of released in February, right before the Lunar New Year. There was a big press conference that got a lot of coverage, much to our delight. Congresswoman Grace Meng was there, Professor Russell Zhang, who works with Stop AAPI Hate, Professor and President of Queens College, Frank Wu, was there and also wrote a foreword to the paper. And so we got the paper out, and it got a lot of attention immediately. We thought that was going to be, kind of the big event. And unfortunately, in the country, there were just a number of atrocious incidents and violent attacks that kept this topic, I think, at the forefront of the news cycle. And really, if there is a silver lining, it is bringing a lot of attention to this issue. And so since February, we've been extremely busy talking to a number, multiple organizations from all walks. Chris, I think, talked to foreign countries, France, Australia, Germany, Canada, who are all interested in this report. We've talked to state organizations, city organizations, the New York City Law Department, the Economic Development Department. We've talked to academic institutions. Notre Dame asked us to speak to them. A bunch of local high schools and middle schools have asked us to speak to them. And of course, many corporations, many lawyer organizations, bar associations from around the country have asked us to speak on this topic. And so it's been very busy, but very heartwarming to see the amount of interest and real active engagement on the issues. It was very much a dialogue and debate. And I think one of our goals in both writing the paper and doing all of these sort of complementary presentations is to raise the level of awareness, to educate, and to get the public involved in making sure that this issue is something that is prioritized in this administration. We're delighted to see that many of the initiatives proposed in the report have actually come to fruition. And it's not because these suggestions are, super unique or creative, but really they were basic things that were really missing from the government structure and the public dialogue. But with the passage of the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, which incorporated some of our ideas, we've pushed for the White House to make Asian issues something that's coordinated at the federal level. We've also been pushing a lot of change at the state level, which is starting to see some outcomes. And ultimately, I think the paper has done a lot of good to get people talking and to actually get some change. And so thank you all for contributions to the paper, and for those who have participated in some of these discussions, who have led some of these discussions, and for being here today to listen to us. So with that, why don't I turn it over to Young Chen, our Executive Director, to talk a bit about a anti-Asian violence task force that AABANY has put together to help carry our mission forward.
Thank you, Karen. With the release of the report, we as AABANY were not content to just sit on our laurels, having published and released this very comprehensive report that we were very proud of. We saw immediately a need to take an active part in implementing some of the proposals, some of the solutions that we proposed in the report. So we brought together several committees. We brought in the Issues Committee, of which Chris Kwok is the chair. We brought in the Prosecutors Committee. We have Joe Gim here, who is one of the co-chairs. We brought in the Student Outreach Committee, represented by one of our outstanding student leaders, Tai Chan. And we also brought in the Academic Committee, represented by Elaine Chu, who's also here. And we also brought in our Legal Referral and Information Service Committee. And we've been meeting weekly since February, shortly after the release of the report. We've been focusing attention on three major prongs of action. The first is education and communication. Next is advocacy, and finally research. And I'll get into each of these. We've also kept Terry Shen as president in the loop of our meetings. And we've also included our immediate past president, Sapna Pala, who was very involved with us last year when we were working on a lot of our anti-Asian violence initiatives. And then we also include in the loop our president-elect, Will Lang. So first on the education and communication front. So that's a lot of the speaking engagements that Karen King went through. So I definitely won't repeat that. But I can tell you from early March, from our first presentation, I believe it was Bank of New York, and that sort of reached us even before the report was released. But it seemed like since that first request, we just were flooded. In part, I think, in that first presentation, we had nearly 100 people. I lost count of how many different corporations were involved, but essentially it was not just Bank of New York, but it was a group of Asian affinity networks from major corporations, and everyone by that point was very concerned about the spike in anti-Asian violence, and the main question was, well, what can we do? And it was great that they were able to reach out to us, and we were able to provide some information and suggest some answers. But in addition to the education that we do through these speaking engagements, we've also worked on Know Your Rights brochures. And I'm proud to say that we issued our first Know Your Rights brochure last week. And this is what we call the community brochure. And if Candace, if you can just pop it up on the screen so everyone can see it, that'd be great. But the general idea of this Know Your Rights brochure is to inform Asian American community members in very straightforward and plain language what to do if they encounter anti-Asian violence. We also have had it translated into Chinese, both simplified and traditional. And we're working on in translations to other Asian languages. So we'll be hoping to release that fairly shortly. And certainly for those of you who are here and now that you know about it, we hope that you will also share this resource with people in the community that you know. Another initiative on the education front that we're very excited about, I'm going to ask Joe Gim from the Nassau County DA's office to talk about. And I also want to mention and congratulate Joe on being appointed the head of the newly minted Nassau County Hate Crimes Bureau. And he's going to be working with Elaine Chu, who is a professor at St. John's University School of Law, to do a webinar on self-defense when one is confronting anti-Asian hate crimes. So Joe, can you give us a couple of minutes about that?
Hi, Young. Thanks for this time. Just to describe sort of the Prosecutors Committee's role in the Anti-Asian Violence Task Force. We've participated in CLEs at the beginning of the pandemic. I believe they're still online, even on YouTube, and a lot of what we talked about ended up being, unfortunately, very prescient. So we've participated as speakers in AABANY events related to bias incidents, just describing the criminal statutes, and also identifying gaps in terms of the law enforcement community from an insider's perspective. So we really perform sort of support roles to what the Anti-Asian Violence Task Force is doing. We are limited for the most part through the Conflict of Interest Board and some of the restrictions that are placed on prosecutors specifically in terms of being involved. And it's been a real plus for us to be able to give our knowledge to the task force. And then Chris is really, along with our other members in the task force, has been able to take that information and turn it into action and advocacy. So, in that support role, we've really been bulking up our ability to talk about the laws themselves. And unfortunately, there is a lot to talk about on that front. So in part and parcel with us expanding some of our programming to deal specifically with the legal implications, the criminal legal implications of this anti-Asian violence, we're going to do, I believe, the first of its kind, a self-defense and defense of others seminar. It's going to be occurring on June 2nd at 5:30 p.m. It should be up on the AABANY website. So I'm hoping everyone, while you're listening to us, are also registering for this event. Myself and Elaine Chu will be addressing the full gamut of justification as it's known, and also just describing the law as it stands and its implications for bystanders and how they can be participants in stopping Asian violence while also protecting themselves. So that's really the bulk of what we do, is behind the scenes and also engagement with the community, both the Asian American Bar Association and you members right here, but also providing some knowledge for the group so that they can advocate on our behalf, from a position of knowledge.
Great. Thanks, Joe, for that. And we also are doing a fair amount of advocacy, and I want to say Chris has been leading on that front. So Chris, I'll turn it over to you to talk more about the task force's advocacy efforts.
Yeah, once again, I've just been sort of so lucky to sort of be the face of it, but having the team and having, as Joe had just said, having all these sort of knowledge and resources pouring into AABANY, and AABANY sort of leading that conversation in front of the public, in the press, to the police department, to the district attorney, just advocating for sort of holes in the understanding of how anti-Asian hate operates with Asian Americans, how discrimination operates with Asian Americans, how it overlaps with other types of discrimination, but also has its unique factors and its unique history, much of which is forgotten or obscured. Today is the anniversary of the death of George Floyd, and some of the things that we've heard about is like, Asian Americans or Asians, think like, do I have to like choose between supporting BLM? Do I have to choose between supporting anti-Asian hate? And we've been out there saying we don't think you have to choose. As a matter of fact, we think if you boil it down, this is the same fight. This is the same fight against discrimination, against structural racism, and so we've been out there just advocating for the treatment and for the law to apply to Asian Americans, and then also sort of advocating for a very more informed view about how to go about this debate, because we do find that a lot of Asian Americans are having a political sort of awakening, for the first time, dealing with these issues. So on many fronts, we're sort of advocating not only with law enforcement, but also within our community, in working with other communities, and it's just been an incredible effort. And part of this briefing, this celebration, is to tell you where we've come from, and invite you to be a part of it. And because we have developed initiatives to answer the question of what next and what can I do. And we've heard that, we know, and we've been hard at work at coming up with a platform so that we can have everyone that wants to contribute to do so.
Great, thanks, Chris. And then finally, on the research prong, I'll just quickly mention a couple of things. So one of the things we're looking into is data tracking and mapping. We're seeking to develop tools to track incidents of anti-Asian hate in New York City, and then map these incidents in ways that can be readily comprehended and utilized. We're also looking to analyze policy and legislative reforms to address the deficiencies and inadequacies of current law as they affect AAPI community members who encounter hate crimes and bias incidents. And I think on that note, I'm going to turn to the next major topic, which is something called the Turning the Tide Fund. So I'm going to ask Candace to pull up the slides on that. So the Turning the Tide Fund is AABANY's Anti-Asian Hate and Violence Action Fund. Let's move to slide 2. So as I mentioned, after we published the report, we moved forward to try to implement some of the ideas that we put forward. So let's go to the third slide. And to advance the proposals outlined in the report, consider other solutions, and address the surge of anti-Asian hate and violence, we've established the task force, and we partnered with our 501c3 affiliate, the Asian American Law Fund of New York, also known as AAPI, to implement a multi-pronged action plan to turn back the rising tide of hate and violence. So if we go to the next slide, I mentioned the education and communication, the presentations we've been doing. I mentioned the first Know Your Rights brochure, but we're also preparing another one that is going to be more of a guide for legal professionals, and to help them assist those who have encountered anti-Asian hate and violence, we'll get more into more specifically into what lawyers can do about that. We're also planning to film some professional public service announcement videos, and they'll be developed out of these brochures that we're making. And then let's move to the next slide on advocacy. So we've advocated for increased funding for hate crimes units in the prosecutor's offices, as well as at NYPD. We've been meeting, as Karen King had mentioned, with leaders in government, in various government agencies. And we've developed the Hate Eradication Active Response Team. And that is a program that we're rolling out now. And what we're trying to do there is to connect community members who have encountered anti-Asian violence or bias incidents or potential hate crimes. And we're going to connect them with AABANY members who volunteer to provide support and guidance to these community members. And this support and guidance won't be in the form of legal representation necessarily. It'll be to point them to appropriate legal services, perhaps through our legal referral service, but definitely in conjunction with our pro bono committee. If they need help going to the NYPD or to the DA's office to report the crime, these volunteers will help them to do that. And if they require other assistance, possibly mental health resources, then these volunteers will guide them toward that. But the focus will be on the community member and what their desires are in getting the help that they want and that they need. Let's move to the next slide. And I've already mentioned on the research front what we're doing. So then, I'll jump right to the last slide, which is where people can donate. So people can donate directly through the Asian American Law Fund, the AAPI website. The link is there. It's very simple. You fill out the form, you put in the donation amount, but we would ask that you note T3 fund for Turning the Tide when you make the donation. And if you prefer to write a check, we ask that you write the check to AAPI with a notation that is for the T3 fund, and there's the address. We'll be certainly making this available through our website, but we wanted you all to be the first to hear about it. So with that, I think Karen Yao is on the call. So Karen,
I am.
Great.
I am.
So could you maybe talk to us about the T3 fund and how lawyers can help by giving to the fund?
So Yang, you have covered it really well. I don't think I have very much to add except to really implore all of you to consider donating to the fund. In addition to being a member of the task force, I am a board member of the Asian American Law Fund of New York, which is a sister organization and was formerly called the Asian American Bar Association Foundation. We have worked very closely with each other, and it is now working with us on this particular project, making sure that the funds will be going to the three broad areas that Yang has spoken about. The research, community presentation, the advocacy are so basic to reaching all of the goals that Chris and Karen and Terry have talked about. So I really ask all of you to take a good look at the link that Yang had just put on. Yang, would you please go back to that so that everyone gets the link to the donation?
Sure. I'm going to ask Candace to put that back up and to focus on the last slide. And then Candace, can you also drop that link into the chat for the benefit of others?
Thank you so much.
Great. So thank you very much, Karen Yao. And at this point, I'm going to turn it back to Karen King to talk more about what lawyers and law firms can do. Karen King.
Sure. So I'm also co-chair of the Pro Bono and Community Service Committee here at AABANY, and we're involved in numerous projects, but specific to anti-Asian violence, we are leading the effort with HEART, which is the Hate Eradication Action Response Team that Young just mentioned. We are looking for volunteers to help us with this project. The goal is to help victims navigate the legal process and the criminal justice system to decide whether or not they want to report, to facilitate reporting if they want to report, to provide access to resources, whether it's healthcare resources or mental health resources, and just to provide some community support for these people in need. It is not a legal representation. If the community member needs legal representation, we would facilitate that. So you're not signing up necessarily to take on a client, but this is a project that we think will provide a very useful service and give people someone that they can talk to and help guide them through a very complicated system and process. And we hope that we can elicit some volunteers from this group and from others in the community who wish to help us in this cause. Certainly, if you want to get more active in AABANY more generally, or specifically in the Pro Bono Committee of AABANY, we really welcome the help. I found it to be a very rewarding experience to work on some of these issues and to work with other lawyers in the community on some of these common issues and goals. So that's something you can do on an individual level. Certainly, we need support from law firms. AABANY really thrives on the support from our member law firms, and the support, financial support, and obviously resources for projects is really invaluable. So to the extent you can get the firm more involved to sponsor projects or to sponsor events, that of course is more than welcome and something that we would love to see an increase in. So Young, can I turn it back to you? Young?
Me unmute. Okay. So I think actually we have covered all the points for the briefing. And I'm going to actually turn it back to Chris to lead the Q&A.
Yeah. And then, so we left a lot of time for Q&A because we see this as a community sort of information briefing and invitation. But before that, if we just sort of maybe talk about two more things that I've been thinking a lot about, and that we've been talking about, both Karen and myself, in the presentations we've been doing. One of the things that I heard back was the invisibility, and of course we've often talked about how Asian Americans feel invisible, and in the failure, I think, of to deal with anti-Asian hate crimes, particularly in the beginning, was often due to the invisibility factor. And I wondered for myself, hey, where did that come from, right? I always feel like everything has an origin point, just like Batman has an origin story, like these ideas have origin stories too, and so I went back and I found a case, pretty famous, People versus Hall, California Supreme Court, 1854. And, middle of the 19th century, many Chinese miners came to America looking for gold, looking for riches. But they were often subject to robbery, just like all gold miners were subject to robbery. George Hall, his brother, and a third man came upon a Chinese mining camp, decided to rob it. A Chinese miner, Lin Sing, tried to stop him and was shot dead by George Hall. There was a trial, a very serious trial. They devoted money to it. They got a Chinese translator who was a white person missionary who had lived in China, lived in San Francisco, could speak fluent Cantonese, served as a translator for the trial and for the witness testimony of the Chinese people in the camp. George Hall was convicted of murder and sentenced to death. And the pronouncement was really stirring. It said, don't think you can kill a Black person, a Native American, or a Chinese person. The law here applies to everyone. And you kind of read that, and you're like, cool, that they got it right. 1850, 1853, they got it right. But George Hall appealed because there was a California statute that prohibited Black and Native Americans from testifying against white men. And he said, you should extend that to the Chinamen, to the Chinese people, and because they're not part of our society, politically, civically, or otherwise. And the California Supreme Court agreed with him and overturned the murder conviction, and he walked free. And he walked free, and he was never, the trial didn't retry him. So violence against non-whites was immunized by law in our country for a very long time. That was a real thing. And it was on the books for 2 decades. and then came off the books. But I think the legacy lives on, you know, in our society. And we as lawyers, really the children of the first generation immigrants post 65 to really spend a good time working in the legal industry have a real opportunity to sort of fight those kind of legacies. You know, there are earlier fights. Joe reminded me of how we are in the tradition of Vincent Chin. Vincent Chin was, you know, as we all know, the victim of racial violence. Back in the 80s, that was seen more as a local sort of Detroit, Midwest, Motor City, you know, auto industry dying kind of thing, and not seen as a national problem until the activists there made it a national issue, until Jesse Jackson came and said, I'm going to make it an issue. He had a press conference with Vincent Chin's mother in San Francisco, right? You know, with the Asian American activists to make it a national issue. And Jesse Jackson helped lift that issue into the national consciousness and making an issue. So he really gave us that lift. And it goes back to, I think, some of the questions about BLM and where anti-Asian, fighting anti-Asian hate fit. They fit. It's just that simple. They fit. Fighting those fights fit together. They are not opposed to one another. You know, and I was on a talk show with Jesse Jackson's daughter. It was really cool, you know, and I was just like, you know, so I got a chance to be like, hey, your dad did the right thing. He lifted that issue up. So we want to remember that. And we want to like continue to lift up this issue because it's our fight, our generation, our fight. You know, there's no question it's a national fight and maybe even international, but we won't go that far. But we invite all of you to be part of it. And so I think with with that, you know, we want to, you know, open it up and see if you have any questions for any of us. So feel free, this is not a webinar setting. Feel free to unmute yourself and talk with us.
I think, Chris, people are often shy to get things started.
Okay.
You want to tell people about your interview with Spike Lee? I think that's a very interesting.
Okay. Yeah, no, that was really cool. That was like within the first month. You know, it went crazy. We were talking to all these people, and I got an email that said, you know, Spike Lee's doing a documentary and wants to talk to you. I was like, okay. And my wife was like, Spike Lee wants to talk to you? No, he doesn't. You know, and you know, I was like, I think so. I guess. You know, I love to, and so you know, I said sure. And I went down to his studio in Brooklyn, which is really cool, right? You know, like Brooklyn is where he's from. You know, if you go to Tech, you know it's right down the street. And you know, like from one of my memories of high school, Spike would be he had his store. He had a retail store in the 90s, and he would sell stuff, hats and shirts, and people would walk by and he'd just take pictures. Spike's always been in the community, even though he's always been, you know, Spike Lee. But I remember him from my high school days because that's when Spike's career first began. And if you're really young, you might not remember, but Spike was incredibly controversial because his movies were all about race, and he was unapologetically about race and about the African American experience and about telling the stories that he wanted to. He was got a lot of flack for that, you know. Right now, he's kind of in this gray beard stage where he's like he's an NYU film professor. He can make any film he wants, makes documentaries if he wants. And he was making a documentary on New York City in the wake of 9/11 to COVID-19. And he said, you know why I brought you down here? And I was like, no. And he said, it's because people were asking me, where are the Asians in your documentary? Are there any Asians in your documentary? And are you doing anything about this? And he said, I listened to them and I said, they're right. If I did a documentary about Asian Americans, about New York City, and there were no Asian Americans, that wouldn't be right. And I was like, whoa, you know. And while I was waiting to go talk to him, you walk through the studio and you see his studio is awesome. It's like his playground. There's all this art, there's all these movie posters. And for me, that was going through like my high school, my college years, you know, when I think really the most important part of his career, to be honest, you know, his first 5 or 6 films, I think were really from like, you know, that place. But really, as I talked to him, it was really great to talk to another New Yorker, an African-American artist who was about racial justice, but also about art and about being a truly woke artist, I think in that tradition, doing what he really loved, but also, you know, through art. So we're kind of doing through we are doing racial and social justice through our professions as lawyers, and he's doing it through art. He included us, he included me, to represent us. That was I was actually really touched by that because I was like, wow, first of all, it's really cool I get to come down and chat with him. Secondly, I didn't realize he was a documentary filmmaker. If you think about the documentary on New Orleans and the devastation that was wrought, that was Spike Lee. I hadn't realized it. I wasn't paying attention, to be honest. But it really was, to me, about multiracial coalitions, about him caring. He pulled out Do the Right Thing, and we talked about it in 1989. And there's an important scene where there's racial violence and they destroy the local pizzeria, and then they go to sort of do so to the Korean deli, and the Korean deli owner comes out in his broken English and it says, "You, me, the same." That was his message back in the day, and I think he wanted to say to people, don't forget that message. And if you remember, timing, it happens before the LA riots, and so as an artist, I think he was a visionary, right? And in the sense, that's not so crazy stuff. He's just saying peace. Let's just work together. And he has a really simple but honest sort of truth that can be easily forgotten where we go about our daily lives and we go on in time. But I hope I make it to the documentary. He's interviewing hundreds of New Yorkers. The documentary is slated to come out in September. Like after we interviewed, he like took me to see like 5 minutes of like, the thing. And then he like gave me a wonderful gift, that, said, "Do the right thing." Like it was like a street sign. So it was really cool. Like, I will
Hey,
forever
Chris,
remember it. Yeah.
Chris, there's a question in the chat, and I will read it. It's from one of Karen King's co-chair of the Pro Bono and Community Service Committee.
Yeah.
Karen Lynn asked, will Albany advocate for the passage of legislation to include Asian American history in public K-12 curriculum?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
So actually, let me answer that, Chris, because I'm actually well aware of it. And in fact, Grace Meng's office had released something way back in the fall, which I've been meaning to respond to. But we're very supportive of any kind of Asian American history, because I hope everyone on this call knows about the AABANY Trial Reenactments Project, which was started and led by Judge Denny Chin and his wife, Kathy Hirata Chin. And so since 2007, I want to say, we put on a production every year at the NAPABA convention of a major trial or case involving Asian Americans. And the whole point of it is to show how much Asian Americans have contributed to the political, legal, and social history of the United States. And frankly, not many people know about it. I think during the Trump era, there was a lot of talk about birthright citizenship. That came out of Wong Kim Ark. That was a case involving Asian American. And the Vincent Chin case, a lot of people trace the beginning of hate crimes legislation to that case, because the perpetrators in that case, who never spent a day in jail for the bloody murder of a young Asian man, on the eve of his wedding. Before, part of the reason that there was no way to prosecute these men was because there was no hate crimes legislation back then. So Albany does these reenactments to educate the wider world about all these important cases that still resonate to this day. And I'm definitely supportive of any efforts to increase education about Asian American history. And I'll be reaching back to Grace Meng's office to make sure that they know about our trial reenactment project, which actually has gotten a lot of wide acclaim over the years. Chris, there are a couple of other questions that people have overcome their shyness, so maybe you can.
Yeah. Actually, before we get into them, I just want to sort of note that Joe Kim is the new head of the Hate Crimes Bureau in the Nassau County DA's office. And so I know Joe has to go. So if there are any questions that are specific to Joe, You've got 2 minutes before Joe has to go and do something else because he's got a lot of responsibilities now.
I have a question that's more specific to criminal prosecution. So it seems that even though there's been greater reporting of hate crimes against Asians, I'm not seeing a lot of prosecution of hate crime charges. What I'm seeing is charges for assault or attempted murder, right? There's no hate crime enhancement. There also seems to be a very false narrative in the media that somehow charging hate crime requires an actual articulation of someone's race, when it's actually the standard for evidence is circumstantial evidence. So it's really the same standard as any other crime, but there seems to be this false understanding that hate crime charges are much harder to bring. So do we have any sort of effort to correct this false understanding, but also to bring more pressure on, especially the upcoming Manhattan DA's race, to actually, put forth initiatives and promises about charging these hate crime charges? And also there's this false dichotomy, and I think Chris mentioned this, that somehow bringing anti-Asian hate charges is going to somehow target other minorities. How do we battle that false dichotomy?
Chris, we can spend the next half hour answering that question.
Yeah, but Joe, I don't know if you wanted to answer any part of that before you went, but we can.
Actually, Jen, Jen, it's nice meeting you. It started as a me question and it clearly ended as a Chris question. So also part of well, the members of the task force are well aware is that I can't talk about any other office or how they handle it. I can tell you that I got this job through sort of my discussions in the office, asking permission to participate in the things that happen here. So all I can say, generally speaking, is that it's terrible, it's a quote, but elections matter, right? They do. So you're only as good as sort of the direction that you get from the top. And basically, when they came to me to be the hate crimes chief, I gave them a list of demands. I said, like, look, if I'm going to do this right, I need X, Y, and Z. For the most part, I didn't get them, but I did open the conversation to getting them. And we had some preparatory conversations, thanks to Chris, with members of the community. So we're sort of on the same page. And, it really matters, how, like, each office can do it differently. Each office can look at them differently. I will say this much, though. This is the only crime where you have to prove not just intent, but motive. And the way that you prove motive is usually outside of the four corners of the incident itself, which requires, a good deal of police work, a good deal of investigator work. And that is basically my big ask with the office, was our ability to do that. But you also got to understand that NYPD is NYPD and each office is its own office. So like, it's this weird dance where, you need the evidence, but you also can't necessarily get it yourself. So there is definitely that sort of back and forth. On the reporting front, I think this statute that just got passed is going to be a big deal if the state takes it. And, the good thing about a task force like this is that we are engaged inside the community and outside the community so that we can keep our eyes on the prize, because that money's going to come in. I mean, basically the statute that was passed, for those who don't know, the law that was passed, it doesn't really, like, on its face, it's being touted as, helping the problem, and it can. But the mechanism in which the federal government addresses local issues is through funding. And the funding comes with strings attached that you have to do X, Y, and Z. My reading of the statute, I, along with Ty, I don't know if Ty's on the call, amazing intern with the AABANY office, and we looked at the legislation, and there's a lot of good stuff there that could be used for dedicated reporting structures, like one place that you can call. One big problem we have right now is that there is no one place officially to call. So the Stop AAPI Hate, which is a nonprofit, is collecting a lot of this sort of unverified open data. But there's no single state agency that collects, like, it goes here first, like 911 emergency, let's say they show up and they're like, well, I don't know what this is. There should be like, okay, call this number, you have to call this number. And then there's that second line, because basically from our standpoint as a DA's office, and I can only speak about what we're doing here, I personally want every one of those rejected hate crime incidents in terms of the police. I personally want every bias incident that exists, even if it's not prosecutable, because that's where you get the evidence for motive later. These people don't all of a sudden commit an act of violence when there wasn't some predication, but there is no data collection that I can go back on. Like, let's say somebody shouts something outside of a moving car and they have a plate. I need that. I need that information, and hopefully this legislation will provide the incentive for someone, presumably the state and the state police, which does have a dedicated hate crimes task force, to be a warehouse for this type of information. And if that exists, if that starts getting done for real, and that information gets back to me, you'll see, because it's a chicken egg situation. I came to them with my list of like, I need all X, Y, and Z. And they said, well, we only have X number of cases a year. We only have X number of complaints a year. And, you know, I'm telling them, I'm like, well, you know, there's lots of reasons for that. And what I want to do, what is necessary for a hate crimes unit to function properly, is to go into the communities, encourage reporting, but also to give them a place where they can take those reports. So that's a big deal, and we're going to stay on top of them to make sure that, you know, it's implemented. I mean, not me, because I'm not allowed to do that stuff, but the task force will stay on top of them. Chris is going to stay on top of them to make sure that the money is spent in a way that makes sense to the people on the inside. And I think a lot of what we're able to accomplish in the task force is they are able to get like, look, this is how it plays out. They're saying this, but this is what's going to happen. And that type of insight allows Chris and the rest of the and all of you folks who are supporting our efforts here, it allows us that voice, that precision in our effort, so that we can attack critically whatever comes in terms of like, we're going to respond this way, or we're going to do this. And it also provides a second look. I know Chris is going to want to jump in there and talk about everything that's happening with Queens. I mean, I don't know how much he wants to talk about that. I certainly can't. But, you know, there was a role that AABANY played in some of those cases and some of those instances where you are trying to push the ball forward as an advocate, as an outside person, because, you know, you need it. You know, you've got institutions, you've got elected officials. Basically, Chris brought up Vinny Chin, and I'm listening to the audiobook right now, recently released, talking about the Vinny Chin case. I encourage everyone, even if you think you know the case, to listen to it, because my perspective, my whole mind is blown in terms of the stuff that happened there, as a prosecutor, just looking at it, but also how history's repeating itself, how we're doing sort of a lot of the things that have been done, and we are doing them better. Like we did, but there are lessons that I think happened in that case that we can learn and do better. So it was a really long-winded answer, and I bit at the edges, but I hope I gave you some texture to the benefit of having a task force like we do here. I mean, I am the hate crimes chief here because of the work that we've done, because of the advocacy that has happened on the outer edges. And as a result of that, you'll be able to get audience. And once you get audience, then, you know, once you have an ear, then there's a moment for you to talk about these things. But Jen, you hit the issues right on the head.
Hey, Chris, before you get into the Queens DA, can you talk about the candidates forum that you're planning?
Yeah, I need help. So I think Jen will maybe just volunteered, but thank you, Joe. And,
Sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah. No, okay. Good. I'm going to hold you to it. We are planning a candidates forum, and I was just sort of hoping to catch my breath after today because I've got like two more things. I've got two more things, but Jen, if you're interested in putting forth that panel, we are scheduling that for June, particularly for Manhattan DA, because that's the opportunity. And we understand, I think, particularly once again through the work with Joe and the other, ADAs, how important it is. A lot of people are talking about, hey, we need this new law, we need that new law, and to me, that's like silly talk, because that's like 2, 3, 5, 7 years out. You're basically might as well say, let's just not do anything. You know what I mean? Like, because right now what we can do is get in front of the DAs. We can make sure that the laws we have are enforced in the right way, in a sensitive way, in a way that takes into account history, context, and the Asian American population. And that's what we're doing right now, and that's what we can do right now. And that's on sort of the ground with actual cases. The other part that Joe has talked about is just so true. We are networked in contact with, it's like a big, huge plumbing system, and there's water gushing down from like the federal government. And with people like Joe, we can at the end where the hole opens up, we can be like, there's something coming down the road, we better get a can. Where should that can go? And that's where sort of on the ground work does, where you're involved with sort of people on the ground interacting with victims and people who are charged with crimes. And I can't tell you how important it is to be connected. And once again, it's like the platform that AABANY offers. It's the platform, it's the team, it's connecting and working together that makes us so powerful that us individually could not do it, alone. And that's what sort of how effective we are.
So, Chris, let's try to answer David On's question.
Yep.
So his question is, how does AABANY plan to monitor these hate crime cases going forward to make sure these cases are properly charged? Would the Pro Bono Committee be assigning volunteer lawyers, law students to watch each case as it develops? For example, speaking to the DA's office. So, in fact, Chris, can you, on the first part of the question, talk specifically about the Patrick Mateo case?
Should I? So I'm giving. Okay.
I think you can. They issued a press release about it, and we had a part to play in it. So talk about it.
Right. So, AABANY, after, deliberation felt that, so those of you that remember the Flushing Bakery case, as it's become known, there were two people waiting online to enter into a bakery on Main Street, Flushing. They got into a fight. She tried to mace him. He pushed her into a newspaper stand, and she got 10 stitches on her head. It got, Olivia Munn to tweet about it, so everyone paid attention. So after he was charged with third-degree assault, which is a misdemeanor, he spoke to the New York Times. He recounted to the New York Times via text that he said, "Give me some space." He was not wearing a mask. She was. This is not China. And that kind of precipitated the case. We read it. We looked at the third-degree assault. We saw no hate crime enhancement of that, despite language that would indicate sort of picking on someone because of their national origin or perceived national origin. And we decided we wanted to advocate before the Queen's DA as the Asian American Bar Association, and we did so. And we had a lot of help. From community partners, which I will sort of leave unnamed here, but we really kept the pressure on and put the spotlight to say, WTF, what's going on, and part of that is Asian Americans learning their voice, political voice, to advocate in a way that's just legitimate. It's just sort of just saying, can you explain that to me? And we really put that along with community pressure from great allies, in the community. And we kept the cleat legs on. And we had a quote from the New York Times via text, that really sort of said, what's going on? And without that community pressure, without us paying attention, without us exerting that through community allies, that would have stayed a third-degree assault case that they would have just ignored, that would have just gone nowhere. And we were really proud and happy to at least change or at least advocate for that. And we won't have that ability. It was a nice combination of factors in that case, which sort of gave us sort of leverage, right, to make the right argument. There was a Manhattan stabbing, as some of you might remember, a person very severely injured with a knife that slid into his back, right outside the federal court going to Chinatown. And for many of us have stood in that exact spot, right? How many of you have left a Southern District of New York event and gone to Chinatown to eat something, or walk across the street to get the bus to go home, which I would, right? And but his face was covered. It was dark. The guy came from behind. There's just so much advocacy we can do there. There's a pretty decent explanation. But we are keeping eyes on cases, particularly ones that are in the news. To David's question, we are developing, we want to develop a larger system of maintaining cases, but there's so many. And quite honestly, this is a group of volunteers, so we need to create it, but we have discussed it. We want to do that. But it seems like a tidal wave, yeah.
Chris.
So Chris, you're giving me the opportunity to talk again about heart. Okay, so this is the second part of the question for David. So would the pro bono committee be assigning volunteer lawyers? Okay, so let me again explain HEART. I've shown you the flyer. I dropped a link in the chat, but we'll be promoting more heavily. But the idea of HEART is to help us to get on top of all these incidents and attacks, and to get the volunteers from our membership to accompany these community members who suffer these encounters. And if they would like us to help them report to the NYPD or to the DA's office, we'll help them do that. If they would like us to point them to civil litigators who might be able to file a personal injury case on their behalf, we'll do that. If they have suffered mental trauma or have anxiety, we have partners in that space that we'll connect them with. But it kind of starts with the people here who've taken the time, on the lunch hour to hear from us. Now, it is time for us to reach out to you and say, if you are really interested in doing that work, yes, the pro bono committee is going to connect you with members of the community that believe they've suffered a bias incident or hate crime, and then help them navigate the process so that they can find some kind of justice or relief, or just a sympathetic ear. And I feel like Karen Yao is chomping at the bit to jump in on this. So Karen, go right ahead.
So I would encourage everyone to really consider volunteering for the HEART, because who gets involved matters. So for example, something Jen said remains on my mind, something Jen expressed remained on my mind, which was, why is this dichotomy that if we take hate crimes seriously, that more young people of color may be affected, may be incarcerated, that there is this this dual thought out there. And I think the response is that it's more nuanced, right? There are we're in New York City. Many perpetrators or alleged perpetrators of hate crime are people of color, other people of color. And I speak for myself alone, that I do worry about the over incarceration that is the United States, that is New York City, right? But I think the task force are full of members who are very thoughtful about these issues, right? And same thing with HEART, right? So if you are able to get involved, those things are going to be on your mind. Those things are going to be a part of your discussions when you talk to the victim, right? You are there to do what the victim wants, but the victim may not know, and yet it's going to be your perspectives that matter. If the community member of the survivor of the hate crime only gets to talk to people who encourage them to throw people in jail, they're not going to be thinking about, well, there are other ways of trying to get justice in this case. There are legislators talking about mandatory counseling for alleged perpetrators that would involve other communities of color who have faced bias and prejudice, right? So there are a whole panoply of solutions that we can think about besides incarceration, and who gets involved matters when we think about the solutions.
Thank you, Karen. And, just to sort of, close the circle on Patrick Mateo, a month and a half after we had several meetings and chasing them around sort of community webinars, they had a hate crime enhancement, announced a hate crime enhancement for that case. Obviously, it's just a charge, but we think that, some cases deserve those, not all. And we are on board with using hate crime enhancements. We are on board with restorative justice principles, particularly where no serious physical injury results or the person is a minor, and so we as AABANY feel like all of these are options in dealing with the pandemic that we're in. Of course, we know that Asian American women are really suffering this pandemic even more than Asian American men, that they are, more likely to be subject. As an Asian American male, I have not personally experienced this, but I know that if you look at the statistics, Asian American women in particular are subject to this. And so, these are difficult times. I mean, I expect 2021 for these things to continue through the balance of the year, and for
Right.
things to
And
quiet down. Yeah.
with the Queen's DA's office, it it says so much that the office that said to us that we didn't have enough evidence to prosecute it as a hate crime is the very office that, as soon as it put a hate crime enhancement on it, issued a press release and sent it to us and wanted us to, quote, share it. That
Yes.
speaks so much about the power of efficacy when it's applied justly.
So Karen, I need to amplify on that because having read the press release, I thought it was very interesting that the press release made mention of the fact that they were able to get the enhancement because they finally went ahead and subpoenaed the guy's text records. And, as I recall your account of when you and Chris went to meet with the DA's office and meet with their hate crimes head, and as well as the executive DA that reported to DA Katz, I feel like they didn't even think to have subpoenaed that until you showed them the article from the New York Times where Patrick Mateo himself texted the words that showed that he bore a racial animus that should have led to the enhancement. So I really do feel like we did a service by pointing something out that was sort of right in their face, because up to that point they're like, where's the evidence? We need evidence to bring this case, but you have an admission from the perpetrator. What more evidence do you need? Right? So I think that also points up what we've been learning from this whole experience of doing the report, doing the task force, is that representation really does matter. Because I just couldn't help but have this image that the people in the Queen's DA's office that were making these decisions did not understand anti-Asian violence or anti-Asian history, or the fact that we lived through these kinds of discriminations all the time, year after year, but they have no appreciation for it. It's what Chris was saying earlier. We're just a model minority. Everything's fine.
And as someone that grew up in Flushing and feels very attached to it and experienced racial violence as a high schooler, I actually had not thought about it in 30 years. I did not personally experience it, but actually I'll tell the story because I think it fits. But it's Queens, damn it. Like it's Flushing, damn it. Like, if you can't be like, hey, we got to protect Flushing at least, and you're the Queen's DA, and be like, I care. Like, let's do this seriously. Like, where else is going to happen? Not that it shouldn't happen anywhere else, but this, more than any other place, should get that seriousness. We assume it, but it didn't come easily. And one of the things that made me really furious during very, considered, deliberations between AABANY, a group of lawyers, and them, was, we can't talk about the case, but just because one person is one race and the other person is another race doesn't mean we're like, I didn't say that. I didn't say that. Like, who do you think I am? What are you assuming? Do you think that's what I'm saying? And we're like, no, read this. Look at what he said. And it was really interesting. And I think that's actually what really set me on sort of like the invisibility, to be like, whoa, I'm not being heard here. You hear the words coming out of my mouth? It's like, it was just like really frustrating as a lawyer who like, feel like, when I'm talking, can you listen? And I'm doing it in a nice way. It set me back to 1989, 1990. It was my sophomore year in high school. I was supposed to go with my friends to Bayside. It was an old theater. It's been torn down since then. It was a standalone theater where the Victoria's Secret was, in that shopping plaza in Bayside. I didn't go to the movie because I had church, but 5 of my friends went, all Asian, Chinese and Korean. And they were seen going into the movie by a white supremacist gang that's operated in Bayside for many years. It's called TMR, the Master Race. And if you drive around Bayside, you'll see the tags. And for many decades, that's all they did. They tagged up, right? But they saw, 4 or 5 Asian teenagers go in, and they rounded up everybody. They had like 10 to 20 people with like bats and like bottles, and they waited for them to come out of the movie. And as soon as they came out of the movie, they set upon them to beat the shit out of them. Little did they know that these guys also often hung out together, and they all went to Taekwondo, and they were all like 5th level black belts. So there was actually a really good fight. Like it was probably like a really kung fu fight. Like, they're like, oh, we're just gonna kill you, but no, they got their ass beat too. But they had beer bottles, really dangerous weapons. They sent some of my friends to the hospital. No one died. I actually didn't think about it for like 30 years. You know what I mean? Like it just happened, and then we just went on our business. Literally, we just went on our business. But it reminded me of sort of like the sort of the history of that in Flushing, Bayside, Queens, and not to forget that. And I actually am friends with some of the people still on Facebook. And I was like, you remember what happened like 30 years ago? Can we talk about that now? Because I think it's important that we talk about it. We shouldn't let that history disappear. Actually, I can't get any of them to talk. They're like, oh, it's such history. I don't want to talk about it. And I'm like, okay, I'm gonna have to force you at some point. You know what I mean? Just because I think it's important that we do. Just to be like, no, it wasn't all just sort of peaches and cream and nice and like happy. It was actually, there were periods where it was very dangerous, and in addition to the good times. But we need to talk about that too. But anyway.
So we're down to the last 5 minutes. Does anyone else have any questions?
Hey, Jan, it's Will Howe. Hey, I don't have a question, but I just wanted to give just pick up on the point of representation and kind of give something that actually occurred recently that I thought was quite amazing and kind of illustrates this, which is, right after, as you guys all know, right after the shootings down in Atlanta, the way the press covered the situation, I think our community all had a very visceral reaction to the way it was being reported, right? And we were luckily had the outgoing U.S. attorney for the Northern District of Georgia is a Korean American, right? It's B.J. Pak, who happens to be a partner at my firm, and he had joined us. And very quickly, the very next day, he was able to call a conference and actually get on the call, the FBI team that was working on the matter, the Atlanta police chief and the other sheriff's offices, because of his, prior connections and being the, highest rated law enforcement officer, right, in that area. And on that call, we're actually able to air those grievances quite frankly. And, I was able to join that call, and I was really, really just amazed, because it was not something I ever thought would actually occur, right? In my mind, this, the media was going to twist things the way they were going to twist things, and we would kind of complain about it, and nothing could really happen. And then within 24 hours, we were actually, because, we've had, in that instance, had someone who was, a prosecutor with connections there, was able to, speak on it and get in the ear of all those folks. And, it was really, quite amazing. So, I think the more that we do, the more that we're able to have folks in those types of positions and to have those connections and to be able to, voice these perspectives, the better. So just wanted to share that.
I have a question. Does Albany have a plan to publicize this issue through the questioning of political candidates?
Chris, do you want to repeat your answer about the candidate?
I heard that, but is there a concerted plan to, not only the mayoral candidates, but it's a way of, if we can have a presence in these debates or whatever, and have someone speak up and question the candidates about their role, their views about anti-Asian violence, that'll bring the issue to the forefront, as well as the city council members, in
Right.
The more major districts.
That's, I thought, Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought that's the whole point of us hosting these candidates forums specific to the issue of anti-Asian violence.
Well, my feeling is we should go to the majority forums and speak up.
Yeah, no, Marilyn, that's a great idea. You know, we've done so. I've also done, do outside political stuff through another group that I'm active in called the League of Asian Americans of New York, and we hosted the DA forum, and we asked that question about Asian Americans and anti-violence, anti-Asian violence. Of course, for the majority forums, it's a little bit harder because, like, we might not have like the ability to put a question in there. But the great thing about these Zoom webinars is that we can record them, and we will have record of them once it's done. And so it's going to exist at least on recorded, medium for us to hold them accountable for the rest of their, sort of terms. And we intend to do so. So,
yeah, in fact, Chris, you just reminded me. So we actually participated in the City Council District 1 forum way back in March. And they actually did solicit questions from us. And I think, Chris, you're the one who actually put in the question about the funding for the NYPD Asian Hate Crimes Task Force, right?
Right.
Yeah. So I think Marilyn, Judge Bill, to answer your question, if there are opportunities for us to weigh in a major way, we'll take it up, certainly.
And we have.
If I can just add quickly to that, I think Marilyn raised a really good point, which is when I was researching which candidate has talked the most about addressing anti-Asian hate crimes, there was very little collected information about that. And when I went to some of the Zoom seminars, it did seem like, I think at some point, one of the candidates said that the anti-Asian hate crime incident is overhyped. But of course, if you Google, you're not going to find any record of that. So to the extent, it'd be helpful, I think we can have maybe some sort of report summarizing the candidates' response on these issues across all these various events. And also, I think there's also talk about building of a new prison in Chinatown right next to senior housing facility. And I think a lot of Asian Americans should become more aware of these issues and why they're important in the Manhattan DA's election, not just the hate crimes. So to the extent we can put some sort of report on those issues that also would affect the Asian American community with regard to Manhattan DA's race, that would be helpful. And I'm happy to volunteer for that. So
yeah, no, it's great. Every person that says it gets volunteered for it immediately on the spot. And I think that I'll give a shout out to Alvin Bragg that Karen King had involved him, and he was reviewing drafts of the report in the middle of 2020 with us all the way through and giving us comments. And just in terms of his and I would say that just from reading all the anti-Asian sort of plans from all the DAs, there's no question Alvin's plan is the most detailed. But we will get more into that because, of course, what we're planning is a Manhattan DA forum that is laser focused on anti-Asian violence and maybe one more issue because time is short and we want to be really focused on those issues. And I think a creation of something coming out of that would be very helpful. So I think with that, unless there's any other burning questions, we're going to thank you for joining. And and this is a AABANY-wide effort, AABANY and beyond. We invite you to work with us to help us questions, ideas like this, make our work better because we need you guys. So thank you.
If you want to contact the task force, I just dropped the email into the chat. It's aavtf@albany.org. Thanks, everyone. Have a good one.
Take care.